Okay, so then now before we get into the final segment, I have included this new segment in this season. I called it Know Your Host, where I give my guests an opportunity to ask me any questions you might have. So go for it.
Oh, I love that. I want to know what you think makes a
Mhm.
good podcast guest for your podcast specifically.
One thing I have said since I started this podcast that for me, there is no perfect guest and there is like no perfect story. I feel like every story is unique to themselves and there is always something or the other thing that you can learn from everybody. I know I remember in the beginning of my journey, fortunately, some people who reached out to me wanted to be part of the podcast and come there as a guest. They have asked me that uh, we hope that you consider us. And I've told them, they said, we don't know if there's something extraordinary about my story that you'd like to highlight. And I've told them the same thing. Every story is extraordinary in their own way. And I am nobody to define that your story is perfect or you are a perfect guest for me. No. Because, for example, if you have a certain lesson or you have like a certain experience, maybe it might not be beneficial to me or it might not relate with me, but I'm sure there is somebody, the people, I'm saying millions, let's just say, I'm manifesting that, the millions of people who are listening to this podcast, there might be like one person who might resonate with that and might learn from it. So I think short answer to your question is, for me, no, every story is unique in it themselves and there is no perfect answer to it. Yeah.
When you reached out to me, I was very curious about how you got to create this podcast. Every
Mhm.
podcast has a story, right? There's a reason people
Mm,
do this
yeah.
much work to put out
Yeah.
these kinds of stories. What was the story behind my thick accent?
Well, one thing which I have mentioned a couple of times on the podcast also, I was working in this market research company and I was interviewing somebody over the phone. And this man, in between the conversation, said that, "Oh my God, you have such a thick Indian accent." And to which I replied, "Sir, you also have a thick Canadian accent." So for some reason, that just, yeah, I
I
said that
love
to him
that.
because that's what we have. It was just one of those days, I'm not in my element, I'm just tired, I'm hungry, and and when he said that to me, I said, "Sir, you also have a thick Canadian accent." And he just giggled just like you and he hung up. So for some reason that name just stayed with me, not that I wanted to start a podcast. But a few months after that, I was started speaking to people on the phone who were international students. We were basically interviewing people on behalf of the Ontario's Ministry of Education, the people
Mhm.
who have recently graduated. We were speaking to them, and everybody, Sindhu, I think everybody I was speaking to, I would say 90% of them was at least cribbing about their program and not being able to find a job. And I was actually in the similar situation at that time. That's why I was doing that call center job, because I had nothing else to do and I was not getting any response from anybody. So at one point I was like, okay, these guys need help. And so do I. So I was like, instead of like me reinventing the wheel, let me just collaborate with this incredible people, just like yourself, who are ready to lend a helping hand to individuals. And like you said, reach out to people or talk to your future self. Exactly. I also wanted at some point somebody like me who would have these conversations, have this kind of podcast from which I can learn, because there was nothing like this when I came to Canada 5 years ago. So maybe I'm creating this for my past gurasis, somebody, the future, the new people who are coming to Canada. I am just want to lend a helping hand if they can listen to these stories and feel that, hey, we are not alone into this. If your experience is not validated, you are not alone. If you're not getting a response from anybody, you are not alone. And if they question your identity, or if they question your accent, or if they question that why is English so good, you are not alone. We all have been through that. And if he or she can really dodge that and tackle that and have the blinders towards all these discrimination and hate comments, you can too. So that's why my whole purpose is to tell people that, hey, if he or she can do it, you can do it as well. All in all, it just takes a little bit of time, a little bit of consistency and patience, for sure. Yeah.
Amazing. I really like that rebuttal that you had the presence of mind to give. I think a lot of people, when they hear that, they feel so defensive.
Yeah,
They suddenly become very, they seize up, they feel like they're not putting their best foot forward. And it
yeah,
can make you very defensive. And
yeah.
one of the interesting things that I've seen, I don't know if you've noticed this, and I'd be curious to see what your experience has been. For us, people in our generation growing up, when we were told that we didn't speak great English, or something like that, we were
Hmm,
defensive. But
hmm,
I think the generation now is not like that. They're a lot
hmm,
more, no, no, we're not going to hear that from you. And by you,
hmm.
they're not um, as
Receptive.
worshipping of the West as we, I think, were. We looked at them with so much awe, not worshipping, but awe.
Hmm.
And now it's not like that as much anymore. There's more self confidence in that generation of today than we had at their age.
Yeah, I think one reason of that could also be the exposure and the right examples, because back then we would have like limited examples that we see on the television, for example, maybe in the films and movies. But I think now, because of social media, you find a lot of familiar people, and a lot of like familiar people with like familiar thoughts and identity, so to say, and you relate to that a little bit of more, and you feel that, okay, I'm not alone into this, and there's nothing wrong with me if I speak this way, or I dress this way, or I act this way. There's nothing wrong with me. So I think that's why they have more confidence in themselves, I would say. Maybe
So
that could be the reason. Yeah.
yeah, it's a very interesting point. I do notice this when I travel back home these days, that yeah, their attitude towards um, speaking English, or their personal
Mm.
confidence has increased, which
Yeah,
is interesting.
absolutely. Yeah.
This is
Okay.
very
any
enjoyable. Thank you.
any other question you have?
Uh, I have lots of questions. You shouldn't do this to me. I will ask you lots of questions.
Okay, just one more. Just one more is allowed.
Just one more. What has been your experience living in Montreal?
I think,
The
go ahead.
immigrant experience living in Montreal specifically.
Okay. Well, definitely, I think initially it was hard because everything is in French. But the good thing is people within the city are pretty much bilingual. It's just that to access certain governmental institutions, it's very hard to go through the system, because usually it's in French, and also because of the new policies that they are coming up, that has made things a little bit hard. But I would say by now, since it's been like 5 6 years, I have got used to certain things. For example, I know the restaurants I'm gonna go to, because even the menus are in French, right? Most of them. I know that what I want, I have my go-to order and everything. But as an immigrant, I would say yes, definitely you have like less familiar faces, like comparing it to Canada, to Toronto. Like for example, I recently visited Toronto, and I had this one experience, and somebody was asking me that, how are you feeling in Toronto? And I told them there is some sort of warmth within the city, and that's solely because of the presence of our community, and by that I mean the Indian Punjabi community as well, particularly. And just being having that ability to go to these certain networking events and interacting with these people, I really feel, I wish I would have had that maybe 4 years ago. Or I wish the people who are currently in Montreal, international students in Montreal, they would have had that. That is something that was missing throughout my 5 6 years, Sindhu. And because of that, I have not been able to have enough Indian friends also. I just connected more with my local people, or the immigrant another immigrants who just immigrated to Montreal. So yeah, I would say, but all in all, it's been a learning experience. I am actually glad also I came to this part of Canada, because this city is beautiful. There's a lot of diversity in its own self, which also kind of gives you a different perspective of things which you might not see in Toronto, I would say. So yeah, all in all, I would say it's a very enriching experience. Yeah.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I really am very interested in learning about the experience of people who came to Canada and, you know, settled only here.
Mhm.
Because a lot of the people that I know were in the US. And people in the
Mhm.
US talk a lot about their immigrant experience because of everything that they go through. In fact, there's this trajectory. Every party, it goes exactly the same. You meet,
Mhm.
you talk about not immigration related topics to distract yourself.
Mhm.
Then you
Yeah.
eat, and then you talk about how your visa situation is going, and then it goes
Yeah.
downhill from there. Then it it ends up in how it all sucks. That's the
Yeah.
trajectory of every immigrant gathering in the US. If you've been there for more than about 6 to 8 years, there's a
Mhm.
flow, right? But
Mhm.
here in Canada, I find that's not as much the case. I think up until now, at least, the PR journey has not been terrible.
Mhm.
It's getting harder, of course, but yeah, it's certainly different.
Now, Sindhu, we are in the final segment of the podcast. I call it Beneath the Accent because we are knowing each other beneath the accent. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. You can answer them in one word or a sentence or however you feel like. The idea is just to know more about you. So, ready?
Mhm.
So, first, the classic question: what advice would you give to Sindhu, who is in the initial months of landing in Canada?
It is going to take longer than you think to find your feet here, but it's okay. You'll be fine.
Okay. And what advice would you give to your younger self and at what age?
Nothing. I think it's fine. Young people should just do their thing.
I like that. Okay. Describe a moment when you experienced a significant cultural difference that surprised you, whether in the US or in Canada.
I think I was surprised at how bad Canadians are at salesmanship
Okay.
compared to the Americans.
Oh, okay.
Really terrible in a funny way.
Okay. Do you have any instance to share?
Yeah, like for example, the Canadian banking industry, they act like
Mm.
your mom. Like you can't have a credit card more than
Oh.
$5,000 when you arrive because what if you can't pay it? In the US, it's like,
Mm.
here, go. And if you can't pay it, we'll catch you with 23% interest later. And it's a much more risk
Okay.
taking economy in the US compared to
Mm.
Canada. Canada is very conservative and careful, and
Mm.
there's a lot of guardrails, right? The US is
Mm.
a lot freer.
Okay. Very
Yeah,
interesting. Okay.
yeah.
What's this one dish from your home country that always brings you comfort and nostalgia?
Dosas,
Hmm.
homemade.
Okay. Do you have any funny story related to misunderstanding around the accent or the English?
Yeah, so I once had a question about my taxes in the US,
Mhm.
and I called the IRS hotline for it. And this person on the other side had this strange accent. I can't even place what accent that was.
Mhm.
And I was baffled that they would choose somebody with an unintelligible accent to talk about a topic that is difficult to understand even in the most,
That's good.
understandable accent. And after I think he couldn't understand what I was saying either. After going a
Okay.
little bit back and forth, we just hung up. Like, okay, this is not working. So,
Oh wow,
yeah, it was
that is
very funny.
funny. Okay. What's your favorite cultural festival or celebration in Canada? And how do you usually celebrate it?
Do you mean a Canadian event?
Exactly.
Honestly, I haven't partaken in a lot of Canadian events yet. I want to,
Okay.
uh, but I've
Mm-hmm.
not actually had the chance. The thing I want to do is go to Ottawa on the
Mm-hmm.
1st of July on Canada Day.
Okay.
I've heard it's
Yeah.
very interesting and lively, so I do want to
Mm-hmm.
do that.
Mm. Okay. Interesting. Another festival I've always heard about people talking is on the podcast is Thanksgiving. They said that is something that they have adopted and they have really celebrated in their family.
Ah, how nice. That's a good
Yeah.
idea.
Share a quick tip for fellow immigrants trying to adjust in a new country.
Really open up. You chose to come here because you wanted exposure, you wanted to be in a country that is not your own. Embrace it. If you wanted to
Mhm.
live exactly like how you lived there, you could have done it there for much lower
Mhm.
rent and,
Absolutely.
with a lot of help, raising your children and doing your dishes and your clothes and everything. So please embrace life beyond just what you would have lived in your country.
Yeah, definitely, definitely the best advice. Okay. Tell us about your first friend that you made in Canada and how did you meet them?
This is an interesting story. So, I met them through a meetup,
Hmm.
and they have a very retiring personality. He very self conscious, very quiet. But when you talk to them, they really open up once they know you. And then we decided together, both of us enjoy writing, so we joined another meetup, which was a writers, kind of collective. You get
Okay.
together on certain nights of the week and write. Um,
Hmm.
and gradually I got to know them well, and it was incredible that through a meetup you could have a relationship that is actually
Yeah.
meaningful and interesting and deep. So that was my
Yeah.
first real friendship in Canada.
Share a moment when being an immigrant made you feel exceptionally proud or accomplished.
I think there was this colleague that I had, and this was at a time where immigration was difficult. I was still working. In fact, the worst was yet to come, but I didn't know at that time. And she was quite close to me, so I used to share a lot with her. And she once said, "You should really write a book about all these experiences."
Hmm.
And I said, "Oh my God, you don't know how common this is. There's nothing remotely remarkable about what I'm telling you. It's just that maybe nobody else has told you this. This is so common." And she said, "Well, not to me and not to so many Americans. I don't think you realize how exceptional it is what you folks go through and how you persevere through it." And in that moment, I think I looked at everything that we experience through American eyes and through native eyes. And I was really proud in that moment, for the journey that so many of us undertake. And we normalize it to an extent that we find it utterly unremarkable, but it is remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed, it is. And that's why this podcast exists to celebrate these stories. Yeah.
Totally. It's we should remind ourselves to celebrate it once in a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Is there something that you ate for the first time in Canada?
Poutine, and I did not like it.
You're not the only one. Many people say that.
I think it's just, yeah, maybe it's not for me.
Hmm. Okay. If you had to describe yourself as any animal or any creature, what would it be and why?
Oh, definitely a dog. I have 100% dog personality, I think.
Hmm. Okay.
I think I'm very attuned to the people that are immediately around me. It impacts me a lot if they're not doing well.
Mhm.
And yeah, very much a dog personality.
Okay. If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Wow, that's a great question. I haven't thought about it. There are so many low hanging fruit just everywhere across the world in um, government policy. This has to
Hmm.
be the most boring answer any of your guests have given you. I realize that. I would fix those. Just really low hanging fruit that would make so many lives better.
Well, it might be boring, but it would be very, very beneficial.
Yes,
So please go for it.
yes, let's do it.
If you had to create this one law that everybody has to follow, what would it be?
Just not getting too offended by everything all the time. You
Hmm.
have got to understand and give space for other people to express themselves. There is a loss when people
Hmm.
are thinking too hard about what they're saying. Not online, I'm not suggesting that everybody should just say hateful, terrible things, but there are certain niche ideas that may sound wacky, but I think they should be expressed, because a lot of
Hmm.
ideas before their time sound just bananas, but
Hmm.
there should still be room for it to be expressed.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So describe Canada in one word or a sentence.
Resisting definition.
Hmm.
I love that
Okay.
about Canada. I love that it is so hard to define what it is to be a Canadian and
Hmm.
what is Canada like culturally. It's so fuzzy. And that fuzziness, I think, is what makes it uniquely inclusive.
Wow, I love that. It's amazing how every time I get such a mind-boggling answer every time, because this is, if you really think about it, it's true what you said. It's so true. And somebody who said on the podcast that it's like a quilt with different patches on it, and each patch defines a certain culture that they bring along with it. That's also mind-boggling in its own way. So I'm just always amazed how guests come up with their own eye, with their own, whatever they have witnessed throughout their journey and how they define it. So I
It's
love
a
that.
it's
Thank
a
you for that.
very nice question. It's a very
Yeah.
nice question. I'm sure a lot of
Mm.
thought went into it. It's a very nice question.
So finally, if you could leave me with one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think you put so much thought into the structure of your podcast and everything. Um, Honestly, I was really surprised at how much background work you've done reading through the Substack and the article and everything. Honestly, I can't think of anything. The only thing that I would say to anybody hosting a podcast is to make it as free flowing as possible while still
Mhm.
following a structure. It's very tricky to
Yeah.
do, right?
Hmm.
Where digressions are your friend. Embrace
Hmm.
digressions. That's where
Absolutely.
the real conversation is.
Hmm. Okay. Perfect. Thank you for your kind words. So then finally, how would you describe your experience of being on the podcast?
When we first spoke, just to get to know one another, I really
Yeah.
enjoyed the perspective that you shared of why you wanted these stories to be told,
Hmm.
and just the idea that you wanted a diversity of voices. I saw a lot of overlap between the way we thought about these things, and
Hmm.
the podcast has totally over delivered on that. I really enjoyed it. The fun elements are really enjoyable, so great idea with doing that in season 2, and I'm very fortunate
Hmm.
to have been part of this season. Really
Yeah.
enjoyed the fun parts, for sure.
Perfect. Awesome. Very glad to hear that. So on that note, thank you. Thank you, Sindhu, for being on the podcast and adding value to my listeners. Thank you.
Thank you.